This is question number 3 for the January 2017 Algebra 1 Common Core Regents, and this is just a knowledge question. There's really no algebra or any math really involved in doing this problem. You just have to understand what the correlation coefficient is. The correlation coefficient is R in our data readout when we do a data set in a calculator. And the question is, which statement best summarizes the result? The R is going to be positive when the correlation is positive, meaning when one variable is directly correlated to another variable. And the R is negative when the correlation is negative. So in this case, it says the correlation coefficient is negative. So we can go ahead and eliminate the answers that state that there's a positive correlation. Now the question here is whether it is strong or moderate. And the rule here is that as R, the absolute value of R, gets closer to 1, the correlation gets stronger. So if we have a really low R, basically that means we have a scatter plot like this, where there's really no strong correlation. Our line would probably look something like that. Maybe it'll have a little bit of a positive correlation if we get really, really low R value, but it wouldn't be much. Okay, and if we get values that are really closely clustered along a line of best fit, that's a pretty strong correlation, which makes a lot of sense. That basically means that as the x value increases, the y value also increases fairly linearly. It doesn't have to be 1-to-1. It might increase at a much higher slope or a much lower slope, but there's a really strong correlation. So as a general category here, if you get something between like 0.3 and 0.7 for the R, that's considered a moderate correlation. If we get between 0 and 0.3, that's a low or a weak correlation. And if we get something between 0.7 and 1, that is a strong correlation. 1 would be considered a perfect correlation. That would mean all of the variables actually line up in a straight line. But in this case, it looks to be pretty squarely in our moderate correlation. So this is going to be choice 4. These numbers might vary slightly. We've seen some textbooks that call it 0.25 and 0.75 or even 0.2 and 8. But we think 0.3 and 0.7 is a pretty good middle ground for this. Most of the questions on the test are not going to identify, give you something like 0.75 and have you identify between a moderate and a strong correlation. You will have to identify that it's negative, and you got to identify the value of it. And again, for the value, we're talking about the absolute value, so we really don't have to concern ourselves at that point with whether it's positive or negative. Just the further away it is from 0, the stronger the correlation is. And again, that applies for negatives as well. Like this here, what I showed, this is a high R value. This is R very close to 1. Something like this, where we'd have all of our scatter plot values really close around the negatively descending line, that's an R of approximately -1, and that would be a strong negative correlation. So just bear in mind whether it's negative or positive has no bearing on the strength, and whether it's high or low has no bearing on whether it's positive or negative. You just look at the absolute value of the number. So with that, the answer is definitely 4. It's moderate because of the range it falls into, and it is negative because it is a definitely negative correlation.